Crystal McCain, the Director of Employment with the City of South Bend Human Rights Commission. So this month, July, marks the 30th anniversary of the Americans with Disabilities Act. It was signed into law on July 26, 1990 by President George H.W. Bush. Last week, the Human Rights Commission acknowledged two people who we believe embody the spirit of the ADA. Ms. Karen Brandy Comer, who is currently the chair of the commission, and Mr. Kent Lauderman, who has worked with the veteran community for 50 plus years. Both have worked in this community to champion the rights of persons with disabilities. And so we appreciated them last week and we applaud them. And with that, the focus of this webinar is celebrating the 30th anniversary of the Americans with Disabilities Act. And co-hosting with me today is Michael Patton, who is the Diversity Compliance Inclusion Officer for the City of South Bend. Michael, did you want to say something?
Sure. We're so pleased to have Robin Jones to join us as we celebrate the 30th year of the American Disabilities Act. Very important to celebrate as we certainly look at how we continue to impact people who have disabilities and how we as well make things better for them. So Robin, glad to have you today.
Thank you.
And also we have co-hosting by phone is Ms. Karen Brandy Comer, who I mentioned earlier was the chair of the commission. Karen, do you want to say hello?
I just am so pleased to be able to be on this call. As a great deal of you know, the ADA is part of my life, and to celebrate it and to make it public to the community is the best thing that we could do.
Thanks, Karen. Our presenter today is Ms. Robin Jones. She is the director of the Great Lakes ADA Center at the University of Illinois, and she has a great presentation for us. And Robin, I'll turn it over to you.
Well, great. Thank you very much, everybody. And it's a pleasure to be here and to be joining everybody virtually, as many of us are doing nowadays, as a way to meet and greet and talk. And it's nice that we have technology that allows us to continue to stay connected in times like this and to celebrate. Though many people were very disappointed by the fact that they were unable to hold their celebrations in person and such this year. It's something that people look forward to every 5 years or so, or even on a yearly basis. I think every anniversary is an important anniversary, but we particularly the milestone anniversaries. And I remember back to the 25th anniversary where we had quite a bit of activity going on across the country, including in your area and such. And so, you know, here we are at 30 years, and Sunday was the anniversary, but we're continuing to celebrate. It's been interesting because of moving to more of a virtual environment. We're seeing activities taking place all the way through the month of July and also into August. I still see some things that are planned to celebrate the anniversary. So that's great. It lets us prolong the celebration and make sure that all of the due is done in recognition of this particular piece of legislation. As I introduced, I am the director of the Great Lakes ADA Center, and we are a federally funded technical assistance center on the Americans with Disabilities Act. We've been around since 1991. And it's interesting because we have spikes in our activity. There are times when we have more calls than others and such, and a lot of that is often triggered or sparked by events that happen in the community and such. And so, of course, you can imagine what's been going on in the last several months with the COVID and what that has presented for people in regard to different types of activities and challenges to address and such. So I'm going to be talking a little bit about where we are today, where we've been, and then what we have to look forward to the future, because as my title says, we are not done yet. So as we look to the signing of the ADA, and many of us were reflecting back on that day, July 26th of 1990, when we were all at the White House, and it was a sweltering hot day, and it was kind of interesting because this Sunday was the anniversary date, was also one of those sweltering hot days here in Chicago with the heat index at 100 plus and such, and that was very similar to what happened back in 1990 with the signing of the ADA. But at that point, when George H.W. Bush was signing the law, and he lifted his pen, he said, "With this pen, He said, "Let the shameful wall of exclusion finally come tumbling down." And that was really a monumental time and a point in history where we definitely recognize the fact that the years and years of discrimination, the years and years of disenfranchisement of persons with disabilities was finally at a point where we had a piece of legislation that we could point to. But at the same time, he reminded us the fact that you can legislate certain things. You can legislate what a building looks like. You can legislate having a ramp installed and such, but it's attitude that is very difficult to change. And I'm going to talk a little bit about that more as we go on here today. But it is important to remember back to those days, President Bush was very much a part, and so was his son subsequently, because he was the president when we had the ADA Amendments Act that was passed, which was another monumental piece of legislation which addressed the definition of disability under the ADA and clarified a lot of the things that happened in the courts that were limiting access for people with disabilities. And I think it's really important when we look historically, and many people will criticize, and it's been interesting to read some of the articles and listen to some of the commentary around the 30th anniversary, where people are quick to point out what hasn't been done. And such. And I think that that's important. I think you do have to recognize where you've been and where you're going and what still needs to be done. But at the same time, keep it in context to the fact that we as a society have moved slow in a lot of areas of civil rights, whether it be for individuals with different minority groups, in different religious groups and things, whether it be sexual orientation, etc. We tend to be slow and even with pieces of legislation being passed, you cannot flip that dime, in one day. It takes a long period of time, of generations, actually. And it's interesting because if you think about it, 30 years, anyone who's 30 years old at this point would be what we would call the ADA generation. The individuals that were born during the ADA who were born with rights. And there's a huge sector of the population who were born before the ADA who didn't have rights until the ADA was passed. And so we have to also keep that in perspective, because as we look at the youth and we look at their energy and the activities and things, and they're helping us to push forward in a lot of the agendas and things they have, we can't forget what people experienced in the past in regards to the learning, how to do it, and what that actually took and what you have to do to sustain it.
Robin, I'm glad you brought that point out. Excuse me, because even in my travels and journey, you hear people complaining about what's not happened, what should be happening. And we live in a society where people, what I call a microwave society, and they want things right now to occur. But I'm glad that you have expressed it in the way that you have, in that there's a process to this. And though we're 30 years into the act, it's still as well working its way out. And we continue to add to it as well. And those things don't manifest themselves right away.
No, absolutely not. And I think that we just always have to keep it in the perspective of where we are, and recognize where we've been, where we are now, and where we need to go. So definitely, thank you. Mm-hmm. Okay, let's start with some facts, just so we all have the same understanding of who we're actually talking about in the society. So according to the census, and this is what they released as part of the anniversary for this year, the census released at about 40.6 million people. That's about 12% of the non-institutionalized population have some level of disability. When you add the institutionalized population of people with disabilities to this, you're actually up more in the 56 million level of persons with disabilities. Oftentimes we don't recognize or don't talk about that large sector of the population of people with disabilities who do reside in institutional settings across our states and across the country. And that's still an ongoing area of concern, and one of those areas where we could do better in relationship to trying to get more people out into the community, giving them an opportunity to live in the community itself outside of an institutional setting, especially individuals who who would qualify, not needing as much of the nursing and other kinds of high levels of care that they might find in an institution. And even those individuals who might have a higher level of care, the research has shown that it is actually cheaper to care for people in the community than it is to care for them in the institution. But this is another area where we have biases. We have a lot of institutional bias in this country as it relates to people with disabilities or older individuals and such of that nature. About 40% of people with disabilities are over the age of 65. That should be a reality check for all of us as we are aging, and every year that goes by, tick tock, we are acquiring some type of limitation potentially. Don't look at those stairs the same way that you used to when you want to go rushing up and down those stairs. Or you might not have the same lung capacity, or your hearing might become diminished, or eyesight. I didn't wear these eyeglasses at 39, but boy, as soon as I hit 40 and every year thereafter, my prescription has gone up in my vision, as far as my vision loss and such of that nature. So we have to recognize that limitations come with age, and we might not identify as a person with a disability. In fact, a lot of individuals in the older population would never say that they are a person with a disability. Their response to me when we talk about limitations is, oh, I'm just getting old. That's just, that's just me getting old. Well, the reality is it's a limitation. And this is something that we have to recognize when we look at how a society has changed, and we look at some of the things that have happened, whether it be curb ramps or it be automatic doors and things of that nature. These are things that benefit everybody. They're not just for that person who uses the wheelchair and such. How many people have gone into the larger stall at the restroom because you've been traveling with a piece of suitcase, luggage or something, and it's easier to get into that larger restroom stall than it is to get in those tight ones where you have to squeeze in with your suitcase and such? How many people have taken advantage of that elevator versus the stairs, or that ramp instead of the stairs? How many other individuals have taken advantage of some of the areas? And we know that parking is a huge issue. Everybody wants that parking space that's up close to the door, to the point where they'll even fraudulently create or try to get a hold of a parking placard so that they can park closer to the mall entrance or whatever else it might be, because they like those kinds of things. Even in the housing industry, I have friends who work in the home modification arena and said, that it used to be, if you look at homes that were built in the 40s and the 50s and even into the 60s, bathrooms were very small. They were not considered to be very valuable real estate. And so you wanted bigger rooms, you wanted bigger bedrooms, or you wanted bigger family rooms and kitchens and stuff. So your bathrooms were often small. Now, if you're going to building a house, the bathroom is often the biggest room in the house, because it's also, everyone wants the spa tub and the big shower and the, lots of space in their bathroom, and the bathrooms are as big as rooms these days and such. People want that space. Well, that's a universal design issue. That really facilitates people who might at some point need to use a wheelchair or a mobility device or something of that nature, creates a lot more accessibility in that regard. Smart homes, think of smart homes. People who are using their technology to turn their lights on and off and things of that nature. That's technology that was actually developed for people with disabilities originally, to be able to turn their lights off or to be able to operate certain kinds of equipment and stuff if they were paralyzed and couldn't turn a switch and things of that nature. Now people want it for convenience. People want it to use it for other reasons. And so, a lot of the things that were originally developed specifically for the disability community have now shown that they are adaptable and desirable to the general population. About 32% of Americans with disabilities aged 18 to 64 are currently working. Now, there's a lot of times that we talk about the unemployment rate of people with disabilities as being 70 and 80%. That's really not a fair way to look at unemployment, because we don't look at the unemployed population of people without disabilities in the same way. When you look at the issue of unemployment and you look at unemployment numbers, that's actually measuring the number of people who are currently seeking work who are unemployed. And so you have to look at it in the context of that same when you look at people with disabilities. So we know there's about 32% of people with disabilities in the working age who are currently working, but about 2/3 of the people who are unemployed who are not working, who are people with disabilities, want to work. And that's a key important issue. So the issue is not that people are enjoying sitting at home and collecting benefits and things of that nature. There are people who want to work but are struggling potentially to find a job. And this is being exacerbated in the current pandemic situation. I'll talk about that in a minute. But we do know that there are people with disabilities who want to work, but they continue to struggle to find those opportunities, that those employers who are going to take that chance and hire them, give them that opportunity, and then the services and the programs being available to help them gain the skills. Oftentimes, unfortunately, and this is something that's still pervasive in our society, is we often don't have the same expectations of individuals with disabilities as we do as people without disabilities. Oftentimes, our family members, our schools, our educators and such don't have the same expectation that somebody with a disability is going to excel in their education and go on to become a lawyer, or go on to become a doctor, or go on to become a CPA or something of that nature. They, oh, you never could be a doctor, you're in a wheelchair. Well, I'm going to tell you, I've seen at least 4 people in wheelchairs graduate from the University of Illinois here at Chicago in wheelchairs, and are successfully practicing as physicians. There's a lot of technology that helps them. I know one who's actually a surgeon, and he has a stand-up wheelchair, and that wheelchair can actually stand him up so he can be at the table when he is doing his surgery and such. I mean, these are possibilities. I know of a woman who's a nurse and she only has one hand. Somebody's going to say, wow, how does she do an IV, or how does she do those kinds of things? She's adapted. She's extremely good, and she doesn't, the technology's allowed her to take a blood pressure with only one hand and to do a lot of things one-handed. So sometimes I think we don't think outside the box. We don't think and continue to say there's possibilities for everybody. Yes, not everybody's going to be a doctor, not everybody's going to be a lawyer, not everybody, but that's in the general population. Not everybody's going to be a lawyer or a doctor or a CPA or whatever. So we have to make sure that our expectations are held at the same level for people with disabilities as they are people without disabilities. And this continues to be a problem, issue in our society today. It's gotten better, but it's still there.
Well, Robin, from what I've seen, the word disability and handicap has always had a connotation of I can't do, or I'm just stuck in my situation. And what needs to be given forth is the fact that no matter what your disability is, this is your normal.
Yep.
And whatever it is you want to do, you can do it. We have to let the youth, because there are youth. I know you talked earlier about, I call it the baby boomers that are coming up now. And we're all getting older and getting into nursing homes, et cetera. But there are people that are behind us, the youth that are disabled as well. And they need to know by example or stories or whatever that it can be done. We need to get those stories out there that it can be done.
I agree with you, and I think that's why we've really worked to support some of the organizations like National Association of Nurses with Disabilities, National Association of Physicians with Disabilities. There's a group of lawyers with disabilities and such. So that they really need to have their stories out there that that they have been able to achieve. Whether they have autism, whether they have a spinal cord injury, whether they have a mental health issue or whatever else it might be, that they can succeed. And it doesn't always mean that I have to be a lawyer or a doctor too. Maybe I'm successful in whatever I do, whatever I decide. Maybe I want to be a mechanic. If I'm successful at it, hey,
exactly.
That's exactly where I should be at, but I need to have that opportunity to be there. And we continue to struggle with some of the trades and things of that nature being resistive to admitting people with disabilities like into the electricians union or the steelworkers union and things of that nature. They have, typically had a perspective that you have to be quote unquote sound mind and body to be able to be in those kinds of professions. And, we're constantly trying to work to dispel those myths. And we do need, and opportunities like the ADA anniversaries do provide us sometimes some opportunities to highlight and tell those stories. But I think it's something that we need to continue to do and figure out ways to do that. And I think there's opportunities like with social media and things of that nature to do a lot more of that as well. Than there used to be. You can get stories out there in blogging and websites and stuff much more readily, finding that information if you're somebody who's searching and looking for it.
Yeah, I think our Jobs for America does a splendid job across the country. We have Work One centers that are helping people with disabilities to find employment opportunities. And then, of course, I'm a veteran, and so you have VA and other organizations out there that are helpful in this way, most especially with those who have disabilities in finding employment and or as well helping them to launch businesses that give them an opportunity to work as well.
Yeah, entrepreneurship is huge. That opportunity to be an entrepreneur, have my own micro enterprise or whatever else it might be is great. And I think, you point out that there are a lot of programs like the workforce centers and the VA and such. But what I continue to find in the work that I do is that oftentimes there's still that sector of people who don't know about those services.
That's right.
That don't know that they're out there. And so we're constantly at struggle with trying to connect people with the right services and the right programs. As I have a very good friend of mine who reminds me on a regular basis of the fact that, Robin, I didn't get a manual when I became disabled. There was no how to be disabled manual that was passed out to me, when I, in this case, she broke her neck and such. And she goes, so I've had to learn it. I've had to learn it through friends. I've had to learn it through, getting involved in organizations and things of that nature, and having to search for it. There's not a ready one-stop place that you can get all the information about becoming a person with a disability,
Sure.
And link it all those things. So I think that's our ongoing struggle. And I think, cities and communities like South Bend and universities and other places really have a role to play in getting that information out to the people that they serve, and that are that they connect with on a regular basis to help bridge that communication gap for sure. So the current labor workforce, you see my numbers here, we have a high percentage of people with disabilities. Now, the COVID-19 has significantly increased the unemployment rate of people in general across the board, whether it's people with disabilities and without disabilities. But unfortunately, what we're seeing is the rate of people with disabilities being unemployed is staying more steadily higher than people without disabilities. And largely because as businesses have reopened, that there is a lot more competition for the positions that are available because so many people lost their jobs. And so now this gets back to those attitudes and the issues with employers and some of the biases that they might have when they have a pool of applicants to hire, and that person with a disability is among those applicants. Often that person is overlooked, and they hire the person who doesn't have a disability, maybe because the employer doesn't understand reasonable accommodation. Maybe that employer has some biases against disability, concerned about those issues and things. Also, a lot of the sectors that a lot of people with disabilities are employed at are sectors and industries that might be impacted by the use of facial coverings, which can often be a barrier for people with disabilities. So a lot of the positions that might be in retail or restaurant or food service and things of that nature, which happens to be one of the higher employment areas for people with disabilities, I have to have a face mask to be working in the store. I have to have a face mask to work in the restaurant or whatever else it might be. And if I can't wear that face mask or facial covering due to my disability, now I'm potentially precluded from those employment opportunities. And I'm going to talk a little bit more about both opportunities and challenges in this area. But I think, looking at it, we do still have this high unemployment rate. It is still of great concern, and more so in the current situation, and we don't know. If we look back historically, and unfortunately the numbers were not kept in the same way that they are now, back when we looked at the recession in 2008 and things of that nature, but the numbers that we do have from back then show that we also had a very high unemployment rate of people with disabilities at that time comparatively with people without disabilities for largely the same reason, that they had a limited number of jobs and more people competing for them. So employers had more choices, and they often weren't choosing that person with a disability for that particular position, which is a disadvantage. So, as I said, there's some challenges and there's some opportunities here with our current situation for employment of people with disabilities. I've already talked about the fact with the higher unemployment rate, with competing for limiting jobs, issues also not just with the use of facial coverings, but also risks of using public transportation. Many people with disabilities who can't drive or don't have their own vehicles and such have to use public transportation, and of course the risks associated with potential transmission and such on public transportation. transportation can be of concern. So if my only way to get to and from work is public transportation, that may limit me, or that may dissuade me from going and working in certain areas where I might have to travel and such. But at the same time, it's provided some new opportunities. So, you know, when in the work that I do, I work a lot with employers. And one of the things that we look at oftentimes when we talk about reasonable accommodation is what kind of creativity can we use to allow somebody to work who might have difficulty, let's say, has fatigue. And, you know, could they work 2 days a week at home, 3 days in the office? You know, could they do some kind of a alternating work schedule, something of that nature? And prior to this, employers were always largely saying, no, we don't have any work at home policies. You have to work in the office. You know, that's a requirement of the position, et cetera. Well, wow, March comes along of 2020, and we have a state by state shutdown, or a national shutdown of the economy. And suddenly businesses out of necessity are moving people to work at home. And they're having to figure out how to do that and how it can be done productively. And lo and behold, what did they find? Wow, we can keep our businesses going. Wow, our employees can be equally as productive at home as they are sitting in the office. In fact, in some situations, they might actually even be more productive, not traveling and doing things, you know, so they're more attentive and more focused on what they can do and the hours of work that they can do. Well, now, do we have the same argument to say, hey, if that employee needs a reasonable accommodation, even as we move people back into the office, of not being able to come into the office on a daily basis or whatever, how can we now prove, or how can we argue that a virtual work environment isn't a reasonable accommodation? Now, for every position, it's not going to be. If my position is customer service, meeting people at the door, you know, or serving people behind a counter, you know, at a store or something like that nature, I can't do that virtually. If I am a, you know, an intake nurse in the emergency room or whatever it might be, I'm not going to be able to do that virtually and such of that nature. So it's not across the board every position that can be done virtually, but what we know and what the pandemic has taught us, that there's a lot more productivity that can be done in the virtual space, and a lot more tools available that people with disabilities can take advantage of to demonstrate that they can be as productive in a work at home environment as they can be at a work in the office environment. And so this is really going to change that game as far as employers making an argument around these things moving forward. Also, we're seeing the technology really respond. It's kind of interesting. Prior to this, even though there have been a lot of work platforms and things like we're using Microsoft Teams here, or Zoom, or Adobe Connect and things of that nature, these are all meeting platforms that have been out on the market for a while and such of that nature. There has never been the attention to the accessibility issues or the different kind of alternatives that can be used in these platforms that there is now, that we're having everybody connecting, and we're needing to address the issues of accessibility across the board. Not always just because of disability, but also because people learn better in certain ways and things of that nature. It's been proven and through research that individuals can often learn and retain information better if they both hear it and see it. And so things like captioning, as an example, that's a universal design method issue. Everyone can benefit from this. Think about the fact that if you're at a sports team or a sports game or something of that nature, and it's really loud, there's a lot of crowd noise and things of that nature, and you want to pay attention to what, you know, the quarterback just did or the baseball player just did, but you can't because you can't hear the announcer. You can look up on that Jumbotron where the captioning is going across the screen, and you can follow along with everything that happened with that particular moment just now, because you can read it on the screen, even if you can't hear what's being said. Same as being done and true in these kinds of environments like the virtual environments. And what we're seeing is a lot more technology, such as automated captioning services that are available within these platforms, such as the one we're using right now. Microsoft Teams has an automatic captioning generator program that will automatically take my voice, generate it into captioning. It may not be 100% accurate. It may only be 80% accurate, but it's better than nothing. And it is a move towards use of technology to create greater access for everybody, and not have it be an additional burden or perceived as a burden because it's going to cost for me to hire a captioner. It's going to cost for me to do those kinds of things. It's being built in. It's being operationalized within the systems and such. We're seeing a lot more of that, and a lot of it's being driven by the fact that companies are demanding it. And we often see innovation by demand. That when there is a demand, supply and demand is operating in a lot of ways here. When you think about it, when I first started working in this field back in the 80s, it was almost impossible, or you paid a lot of money to get a lever handle to put on a door. Everything was round handles. You could buy a round handle at Lowe's or Menards or something of that nature with no problem, cheap, etc. You wanted a levered handle or a lever handle, it was going to cost you and it was going to be hard to find. Now it's the opposite. Now it's the opposite, supply and demand. Everybody wants the levered handles because they're required in the building codes and things. So now you can find all kinds of fancy designs of levered handles, and it's hard to find a round handle.
Right.
It's the opposite, and so this is the thing that we're looking at as we push more to the virtual environment, and we're seeing the productivity being used in the virtual environment. It's responding by becoming more accessible for everybody. The cost is going down, the connectivity is improving, the tools that are available to make sure that it can be used by everybody is improving. So I think these are the positives that we can see out of this kind of thing, and I think that's really going to help us moving forward. And it's really demonstrated and shown us that it can be done, and so we're no longer going to be complacent to say that that it's too hard or whatever, because we know in a dime, in a flip of a switch, companies had to go from being in the office to being at home and being productive at home, and they did it. And so we know that it can be done, which we then know that translates into a potential accommodations for people with disabilities as well. Remove those barriers. So some return to work issues that we're looking at. Right now, we have the issues of at-risk employees. Individuals, due to their own health conditions, may potentially find themselves at risk of returning as the economy opens, returning to their previous positions. It also may be that it's not their health that they're concerned about, but it may be the health of a household member. And if I'm out in the community and I'm back engaging in the workplace and things of that nature, what's the risk of me returning home with the virus and spreading that to vulnerable populations in my home? Could be a spouse, could be a family member, or a housemate or something of that nature. So these are concerns right now that we are seeing, and we're seeing a lot of calls and a lot of activity around what is my actual right here as it relates to this particular issue. We're also seeing a lot of concern, a lot of questions about what can be asked. We're seeing that, again, the requirement for facial coverings in public spaces, both inside and outside. We're seeing temperature monitoring. I was saying before we joined today that when I come into work every morning and swipe in, there is a message for me on my computer that says you must take your temperature, record your temperature, and submit it, to let us know that your temperature is below 100 degrees and that you're not sick. Well, a lot of questions about, well, wait, the ADA says you can't make a medical inquiry, that you can't, that's illegal to make a medical inquiry. Well, we're in unprecedented times. These are, definitely legitimate safety requirement related issues. And as long as everybody is asked the same question, it's not discrimination.
That's right.
Okay, and if I singled you out and made you do it and not made somebody else do it, now we can talk about the fact that you're being treated differently based on your disability. Other permissible inquiries asking you whether you've been exposed to anybody who has COVID, whether you have any of the symptoms of COVID. Again, medical inquiry, but again, it's permissible if everyone is asked the same question. I'm not asking specifically about a disability or a medical condition, et cetera. I'm asking about symptoms. And so that, is a legitimate safety requirement. But a lot of concern, a lot of issues raised around that. But we're seeing this more and more, and it's going to probably be more prevalent as we see the economy open and people taking precautions as they bring people back into public spaces and such. I even went to a restaurant where they required me to have, they had a thermometer and they checked my temperature as I walked into the restaurant. So it's not just in the workplace, it's other places as well. One of the things,
for including this information on COVID and how it has specifically impacted, people with disabilities. The federal government has implemented some special initiatives during this time, like, the CARES Act and these stimulus packages that they're putting out. Has there been any conversation specifically about people with disabilities during this time?
Yeah, there's been some conversation. There's been some monies that have been released specifically to social service organizations, centers for independent living, aging resource centers, aging and disability resource centers and stuff at the local and state level, specifically to help people with disabilities who are living in the community, to address the needs that they have. Things like rental assistance, things like help with personal care attendance, purchasing of PPE, personal protective equipment, and things of that nature. If you talk within the disability community, it's not enough. That you
Yeah.
know and maybe a little late. That that there were many people who really struggled early on that could have used this assistance, and while it's now coming available, there was a lot of hardship early on. Also, the issues of cost that many people with disabilities have experienced in addition, because if I can't go to a store, I'm forced to use delivery services. Delivery services are not provided free. So it could potentially cost me more to do grocery shopping. It can cost me more to get my food delivered and things of that nature, or my medicines. Many of the pharmacies moved to free delivery and stuff of that nature, but not all of them. It really depends on who your provider is, where you live. Are you in a rural community versus a more urban community? I mean, these are huge issues that do divide people depending on where they live and what those services are available. There is, I was just reading the information for the package that is being debated right now in Congress for this. And there is additional monies that is earmarked in there specifically that HHS would distribute to social service agencies that they fund and such. Also to local cities and communities to help with issues that might be of citizens in their community, especially homeless population and such of that nature. That's another area of vulnerability with this crisis that has not received the same amount of attention. And we do know that there's a high percentage of people that are homeless that are also people with disabilities. They have underlying psychosocial or physical disability related issues. So yeah, and I think the biggest issue here is the lack of coordination of a lot of these things. So it's always a concern. Money's great, but if you don't have a coordination of how that money is going to be distributed and how that money is going to be used with a plan, it can often be misused, or it can just sit there and never be allocated. So, we hear those stories even around in the businesses, some of the money that was made available to small businesses, that a lot of it never even got distributed because it was not managed well. Even though it was made available, it wasn't managed well. Well, that's our biggest concern, right? Is that we don't get the money to where it needs and to the services that are actually needed for people. And that, I think is something we all have to be vigilant about. Whether it's the city's able to pull down money, whether our social services agencies, can we partner, can the city partner with some of the social service agencies, to help deliver those services and coordinate those services. And one of the things that we found, that even though the disability community has been much better at advocacy and has learned through their advocacy and what works and what doesn't work and stuff of that nature, a lot of the voice of people with disabilities was late coming to the table, or not that they didn't want to be at the table, they weren't being invited to the table around some of these COVID related issues in our community. And so they've really had to fight to be at the table for healthcare and delivery of healthcare services, and just in general how things were going to be done and what that impact would be on people with disabilities. More has been done, but I think it's again a lesson of learning to do better planning for the future. Should this ever issue arise again, or a different issue, because it will be one, whoever would have ever thought. But I think this is a good example of the fact that be prepared. It can happen. So it definitely an ongoing issue for sure.
Thank you.
So we sometimes forget that the ADA still applies even in the COVID scenario. So as I said earlier, just because someone can't wear a facial covering doesn't mean that they can't do something, or that they are to be eliminated or precluded from being able to participate. What kind of options does an employer have in returning? What kind of remote work or other hybrid schedule and alternating schedule, some home, some in the office, etc. And then not forgetting that reassignment is a reasonable accommodation under the ADA. Maybe I can't do the job for which I previously held because of the current situation. Could could I be temporarily reassigned until this issue changes? Is there another position I could potentially be doing where I don't have that exposure, or don't have those risks and things of that nature? So we have to keep in mind that we still apply the ADA, we still apply the non-discrimination requirements, and we don't just throw everything out just because we're in a pandemic situation. And we have to remind people that it is still an applicable law. You know, the ADA and discrimination, anti-discrimination still is a prevalent thing that should be in all of our discussions and all of our planning processes.
So Robin, how do we make, you talked about the challenges, and it sounds in some senses there was exclusion there. How do we be more inclusive when it comes to the disability or disabled community,
Well,
especially with COVID?
Well, I think it's really important to make sure that they're at the table, not as an afterthought, but as a, you know, proactively. So, you know, it shouldn't be that people with disabilities have to ask to be at the table. People with disabilities, as we put together task forces, as we put together, you know, committees and teams and things to look at things, are we being inclusive of people with disabilities in that mix? And when I say that, it's not just, you know, sometimes we see the tokenism, and that becomes a problem too, where we, you know, we just assign somebody with a disability to be on the group because we want to be able to say we have a disability. We want to make sure that we have the disability voice at the table, which means that somebody who actually is qualified to speak on that particular issue, somebody who actually is able to give perspective, and that may sometimes be more than one. Disability is not homogeneous. You know, I mean, you know, I would never, I mean, I myself have a major, you know, health condition. I would never say that I speak for somebody who's deaf, or I speak for somebody who's blind, or I speak for somebody who has, you know, a mental health condition and such of that nature. So it's not just, it's recognizing that those voices and those issues need to be at the table in the planning process from the beginning and not after the fact. Too often I see things happen and then they say, oh, wait, what do we need to do to make sure it's accessible? We shouldn't be having that conversation. That conversation should have been at the very beginning in the planning process all along, to ensure that accessibility was built in every step of the way, not after the fact to add accessibility, but that it's part of the process, the inclusivity. So, you know, looking across, you know, our citizenry, looking across the experts and those people in the field, you know, that you know, are able to give a voice, whether it be consultative or otherwise. We just definitely need to make sure that we listen to the voice of people with disabilities. Holding listening sessions, you know, having public opportunities for comment on issues and things. If we're considering a policy change or something of that nature, not just listen to what one person thinks who might have a lot of, you know, influence in the disability community, but how does a group of people feel and think about it, not just one, because you really have to see and hear those opposing opinions so that you come up with the compromise situation, and not just what one person's preference might be, because that is a problematic area as well.
Yeah, very helpful information. We're about 3 minutes out from closing.
Okay. All right.
Webinar, and so certainly looking forward to your final thoughts as we prepare to end our webinar.
Yeah, so my final thoughts, and I'm just going to go, you can get my slides. It just talks about a lot of the things that we've already talked about. It's one of the final thoughts here is that this is a reflection from Peter Berg, who is a technical assistance coordinator here at the Great Lakes AD Center on the anniversary. And he says, take a moment today and every day to recognize all of the incredible accomplishments experienced over the past 30 years. As a result of the ADA and the tireless advocacy of the disability community and their allies, we have a society that is more accessible and accepting of people with disabilities. We have accomplished a great deal and still have work to do in order to achieve full inclusion of all society, including employment, business, healthcare, technology, and so much more. So I leave you with the thoughts that happy birthday, happy anniversary to the ADA, and let's celebrate, but let's also take this moment as a challenge for each and every one of us that we can do better.
Thank you so much, Robin. A lot of information in there. And we can hear that you're so passionate about, about what you do and about the ADA community. Thank you so much for that. For anyone who would like a copy
Robin,
of the
could
presentation.
Do we have a little time for me to ask just a quick little question?
Go ahead.
I think you covered a great deal of what I wanted to find out, but Do you know of any, because you covered everything very, very well about the ADA and the brand new stuff that came up as of 1990, and we have come a long way. But do you know of any other type of equipment or accessibility statutes that affect not only just the handicapped population, but also the regular population? Now, you already talked about the curves and the lever doors. Do you know of anything else?
Well, I think there's a lot that's happening in the technology world that, when we look at things like more and more use of our smartphones and apps and things of that nature to be able to do things, that technology is beneficial to everybody. That I can sit in my chair and turn my TV on and off, and I can talk to my Alexa and have her do all kinds of things for me and such. We're seeing some new technologies, emerging, the driverless car, technologies that, have a lot of potential promise for people with disabilities who may, have difficulty being able to drive and such of that nature, but it benefits everybody. We're seeing more and more as technology is evolving, and using technology as a way or an answer to things that might be barriers for people with disabilities that are going to be more conveniences for people who don't have, like, the text-to-speech kinds of things, and the touchless technologies that are going to allow people to be more, maybe potentially safer, because they're not going to have to be exposed to the germs and things of that nature. So there's not any, legislation's a funny thing. We see legislation that mandates accessibility, like the Technology Accessibility Act and things of that nature, which requires captioning on TV and movies and things of that nature. But I think we're going to continue to see disability be integrated into legislation in the mainstream, so that as I'm doing more innovation and things of that nature, it's going to be required that I consider accessibility as part of that design as I move forward. So I might not be designing it with people with disabilities in mind, but I'm going to have to be mindful of people with disabilities, because they're going to be one of the target audiences that I'm going to have to address in my standards and things that I have to meet in order to get something approved or patented or something of that nature. So I think we're making huge strides in that area. And I think that, just stay tuned, because what is new today is old tomorrow, and there's something new again. I think it's impossible to stay on top of all the technology that's out there, but definitely there's a lot that is going to help all of us as we age too.
Thanks, Robin. So if anyone wants a copy of this presentation, you can definitely email Human Rights at southbendin.gov. Again, that is Human Rights at southbendin.gov, or you may call us at 574-235-9355. Michael, did you want to have any last words?
Thank you, Robin, for joining us today. You've shared a wealth of information, and we are grateful for you impacting our community with that information.
Thank you very much. It's been a pleasure to be with you today.
Karen, did you want to have any last words?
I want to second the emotion, and I want to also say that as a person with a disability, I'm in a wheelchair, Robin, because you probably don't know that. It encourages me to know that even though we're 30 years old, we are still growing and still trying to make disability not actually a disability, but a wealth of enjoyment for the whole population. And it was wonderful, the things you told us, and I'm so appreciative.
Thank you. And I would just remind everybody that disability is one of the minority groups that you can become a member of at any time.
Mm-hmm.
Amen. Because I became a member at 34.
Yep.
Thanks, Karen and Robin. Please join us for our next webinar. It will be August 11th at 11 a.m. Deanna Moya will host guest speaker Jacob Sipe, who is the Executive Director of the Indiana Housing and Community Development Authority. He will discuss the Indiana COVID-19 Rental Assistance Program, and we'll also have on Indiana State Senator David Nagoski to share his thoughts concerning the funds provided for the emergency rental program. Again, that's August 11th. And then I just want to conclude with reading a quote from President George H.W. Bush at the time he signed the ADA into law. And it reads, "And in our America, the most generous, optimistic nation on the face of the earth, we must not and will not rest until every man and woman with a dream has the means to achieve it." So thank you everyone for joining us, and we'll see you on August 11th. Thanks so much, Robin.
Great. Thank you, everybody. Have a good
Thank
one.
you.
Bye.
All right.
Bye.
Thank you all for joining us that came on the line today.